The Johnson family had always dreamed of moving out of the city and into a quieter neighborhood where they could raise their children in peace. When they found the perfect house on a charming suburban street, they couldn't believe their luck. It was a picturesque two-story home with a spacious yard, a picket fence, and an old oak tree that shaded the front lawn. It was everything they'd hoped for. Their new neighbor, Mrs. Harper, was the first to welcome them. A sprightly elderly woman with silver hair pinned into a neat bun, she appeared the very picture of kindness and warmth. She arrived on their doorstep with a plate of homemade cookies and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mrs. Harper said, her voice gentle but lively. "You're going to love it here. The street is quiet and everyone's very friendly." The Johnsons were immediately charmed. Over the next few days, they saw Mrs. Bretlet Harper often, as she always seemed to be sitting on her porch, sipping tea and knitting. She waved to them each morning as Mr. Johnson left for work, and each evening as Mrs. Johnson took the kids on a walk through the neighborhood. One afternoon, as Mrs. Johnson and her husband sat unpacking boxes, Mrs. Harper strolled over to chat. "This street has been my home for nearly 40 years, she said proudly. "I've seen families come and go, but none ever seemed to stay in the house across from you." Mrs. Johnson glanced across the street. The house directly opposite theirs was old and dilapidated, its windows dark, with overgrown weeds creeping up the porch steps. "Why not?" she asked, intrigued. Mrs. Harper smiled mysteriously. "Oh, who knows? Some houses just don't like having people in them." The Johnsons laughed it off, thinking it was just an old woman's attempt to make conversation, or perhaps a local legend she liked to share. Life carried on smoothly for the next few weeks. They settled into their new home, grateful for the calmness of the neighborhood and their friendly neighbor. Every day, Mrs. Harper would stop by for a brief chat, always cheerful and full of advice about the town's best spots or local events. But then, small, odd things started happening. One evening, as Mrs. Johnson put her children to bed, she noticed something peculiar. The light in Mrs. Harper's upstairs window was on, and she could see a shadow moving behind the curtain. It struck her as odd, since Mrs. Harper had mentioned living alone. Mrs. Johnson shrugged it off, thinking perhaps Mrs. Harper had a visitor, or maybe she was tidying up. The next night, around midnight, Mrs. Johnson woke up to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps pacing in the house next door. She sat up in bed, frowning, and glanced out the window. Once again, there was movement in Mrs. Harper's upstairs window, a faint shadow crossing the room. This time, Mrs. Johnson felt a twinge of unease. She mentioned it to her husband the next day, but he dismissed it as an overactive imagination. After all, Mrs. Harper was elderly. Perhaps she had hired someone to help with housework. But the strangeness didn't stop. The following evening, Mrs. Johnson decided to visit Mrs. Harper to see if she was all right. She knocked on the door, and Mrs. Harper greeted her with the same kind smile. They talked for a few minutes, and Mrs. Johnson casually asked, "I noticed some lights on in your upstairs window last night. Do you have someone staying with you?" Mrs. Harper's expression shifted slightly, her smile fading just a bit. "Oh, no, dear," she replied softly. "It's just me in this house. Always has been." Mrs. Johnson felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she quickly forced a smile and excused herself, blaming her nerves for making something out of nothing. Yet that night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by a soft humming that drifted through the walls. It was faint, almost a lullaby, but unsettling in its persistence. Mrs. Johnson looked out the window and saw Mrs. Harper again in her rocking chair, her silhouette gently swaying back and forth. The humming was coming from her house. Mrs. Johnson couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. Days passed, and the humming became a nightly occurrence. Each night, it grew louder, more invasive, filling the Johnsons' home with an unsettling atmosphere. The family began to feel as if they were being watched, even when they couldn't see Mrs. Harper. The children complained of strange noises in their rooms, and Mrs. Johnson found herself waking up in a cold sweat more often than not. One afternoon, while shopping at the local market, Mrs. Johnson struck up a conversation with an older woman who had lived in the town for decades. She mentioned Mrs. Harper and how odd it was that the old woman lived alone, yet often seemed to have someone or something moving around her house at night. The woman's face paled. "Mrs. Harper?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Mrs. Johnson replied, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. "She's been our neighbor since we moved in." The woman shook her head slowly, as if trying to process what she was hearing. "Mrs. Harper died 10 years ago. She fell down the stairs in that house. She was alone, and no one found her for days." Mrs. Johnson felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible," she stammered. "We've been talking to her almost every day." The woman reached out and gripped Mrs. Johnson's arm. "People say her spirit never left. Some claim they still see her sitting on her porch, watching. No one stays in that house for long." Mrs. Johnson hurried home, her heart racing, and told her husband everything. At first he was skeptical, convinced it was some cruel joke or local legend. But that night, as the family sat quietly in their living room, the humming started again. This time it was louder, more persistent, and followed by the distinct creaking of a rocking chair. The couple stood by the window, peering out into the night. Mrs. Harper was there, as usual, sitting in her chair, humming. But something was different. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if the figure in the rocking chair wasn't entirely human anymore. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mr. Johnson marched out the door, with Mrs. Johnson reluctantly following behind. They crossed the lawn and approached Mrs. Harper's house. As they reached the porch, they noticed how worn and neglected the house appeared up close, far worse than it had seemed from their side of the street. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the front door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. They knocked on the door, calling for Mrs. Harper, but there was no answer. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, musty hallway. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling. The house was eerily silent, except for the faint sound of a rocking chair upstairs. Cautiously, they ventured inside. The air was thick and cold, as though the house had been abandoned for years. As they climbed the staircase, the creaking grew louder, and the humming became clearer. At the end of the hall, they found a room with an old rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth. But there was no one in it. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the soft humming began again, this time from behind them. They turned to see Mrs. Harper standing in the doorway, her once kind eyes now hollow and dark, her smile twisted into something sinister. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy echo. The Johnsons fled the house, their hearts pounding, and never looked back. Within a week, they packed up their belongings and moved far away, unable to shake the feeling that Mrs. Harper was still watching them. Even after they left, the stories of Mrs. Harper continued to haunt the neighborhood. New families moved in, but none stayed for long. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faint sound of humming drifting from the old house next door. Mrs. Harper's ghostly melody forever lingering in the shadows.